Hello, this is Amin and you are watching session 35 of ASP.NET Core tutorial. In this session, we discuss about another HTML helper, which is EditorForModel, and also we discuss about hidden input attribute. EditorForModel is the HTML helper that helps us to edit or save or store record in database or even in the static repository. Let's click to Visual Studio and implement our project with EditorForModel. This is the project that I have been working so far throughout this tutorial. And first I go to CostController and I will create another action method with HTTPGET attribute. And I use public and its result, it would be iAction result. And I call it edit, and as an input parameter it's received an integer from the URL and from the query string. I will search for this ID inside the stored data, and if I find the record I will return the data to the view. Let's use var, and I call my variable selected cost, and I search for my record based on the ID that I entered from the URL. For this purpose, if you remember, I have one method in cost repository which returned a record of cost based on the ID. That's why I use cost repository, and I use GetCostByID, and I use the ID that I received from the URL, and then I return a view and I pass this selected cost to the view. Then I will create another view inside cost subfolder and I call it edit, and inside this view I use model directive and I bind it to cost, and let me copy some part of the view from the another view that I created earlier, and I use edit cost record as a title, and here I use using, and inside the using I use BeginForm, and inside the BeginForm I can retrieve the data and I can show the data inside this view, same as the created strongly typed view with label and text box as drop down list. But another way to make the process easier, I can use the HTML that I mentioned, which is EditorForModel, and it is automatically present all the current data, and I can modify the data, and also I use one break line here, and after that I use button and I call it save, and its type should be submit. Let's save the changes and run the project. Project is up and running, and I go to cost, edit, and if you remember I have 1, 2, 3 ID in my static repository, and I call it for 1, and as you can see I received the data from the static repository, and I have the data here, and I can modify the data just with one line of code with HTML helper EditorForModel. And here you can see I have ID, and ID should be unique, and here you can see I have ID, while ID is the unique value and we should prevent the ID for any modification. That's why the solution for this purpose, I should hide the ID to prevent user to change the ID value, because here if I change the ID and I submit the form, it is the data will replace on another record, which the ID would be equal that ID number. For example, if I change this ID to number 2 and submit the form, if I code the functionality of this action method in post method, this information will replace on ID2, which is not acceptable behavior. That's why I should hide the ID of each record when we want to modify them. For this purpose, I back to Visual Studio, and this is the model that I use for modifying the data, which is a cost model. And for hiding any property, I can use hidden input attribute, which is inside Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC namespace. And then I should use display value and make it to false. With these changes, I will save the project and run the project to see whether ID will be hidden or not. Project is up and running, and I go to cost, edit, and for example, edit 1, and you can see the ID is hidden, and the user can't change ID value anymore. But if I look at the view page source, you can see I have one input with type of hidden, and its value is encrypted to prevent data breach and to prevent changing the data by some tools, same as Fiddler or Postman. That's why when we hide a property with hidden input, its value is automatically be encrypted. These are the topics that I want to present in this session. And thank you for being with us. Don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel and like our videos and share your idea with us. Once more, thank you for watching this tutorial.